Mr. President, my remarks may take a little longer than 10 minutes, so I ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to deliver my remarks in full.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, we've come a long way in 1 year. On December 24th, 2009, one day before Christmas, this body passed a radical overhaul of our nation's health care system. That's right. The majority passed Obamacare on Christmas Eve. It was not this body's finest moment. It was not the administration's finest moment. And I expect that this debate will go down in history for its persistent lack of attention to the considered views of ordinary Americans, Americans who rejected Obamacare's giant new entitlement expansions and the job-killing taxes haphazardly cobbled together to pay for them. It did not have to be this way. In the midst of the greatest fiscal collapse since the Great Depression, Americans wanted Democrats who controlled all of the levers of power in Washington to focus on job creation. Instead, like teenagers set loose when mom and dad leave town, they did what they wanted to and focused on a government takeover of the nation's health care system. Surprising, only the most ideologically driven support for Obamacare cratered during the town hall meetings of August 2009. The message was loud and clear. Our health care system, and in particular the government policies that contribute to the unsustainable inflation in the health care sector, might be in need of reform. But the solution to our problems is not additional government regulation and control of health care delivery by Washington bureaucrats. And the solution is most definitely not to be found in the billions of dollars in new taxes, most of which will be passed through to American families in the form of higher premiums. For those who did not deliberately put on blinders, the wishes of their constituents were obvious. Stop the push for Obamacare and move on to fixing the economy. But the Senate did not listen. Instead, prodded ahead by an administration that saw the great liberal dream of government-run health care slipping through, the long march continued. First, the Democratic majority cut short the Finance Committee's bipartisan negotiations. Then, heads down, the majority plowed forward on the floor, allowing no virtually meaningful amendments. And before going home for Christmas, it passed the most sweeping reform of the nation's economy in over 70 years without a single Republican vote. Every Democratic senator supported the bill. Not one Republican did, and for good reason. When Obamacare passed the Senate, its proponents assumed it was on the glide path to enactment, but the American people had a different idea. Our national unemployment rate was 10.2%, the highest in 26 years. The American people understood that at a moment of historic economic challenges, the last thing the country needed was another budget-busting entitlement and sky-high taxes. And just about 1 month later, this message was delivered again. In a news shot heard across the world, our colleague, the junior senator from Massachusetts, Scott Brown, was elected in a very clear referendum on the Democrats' health care bill. The verdict of the American people, if the previous summer's town halls left any doubt, was now crystal clear. The push for Obamacare must end. Yet the administration refused to yield. They thought the people would eventually come to embrace the elegance of Obamacare. If only the messaging was better, Americans would appreciate all of the good things that Washington politicians and bureaucrats had to offer them. So after taking time to regroup and weigh their options, Democrats decided to defy the American people yet again. A little over a year ago, the president hosted a summit at the White House and began his final push for his federalizing of American health care. The resulting display was ugly. Americans already revolted by the deals cut in this chamber to secure the bare number of votes needed to pass the bill, now witnessed historic arm twisting and desperate efforts in the House to deny the obvious, that Obamacare represented an unprecedented intrusion of the federal government into the lives of citizens and clearly was a massive burden on the taxpayers. And so it passed. and Obamacare became law. And the administration set about writing the thousands of pages of regulations that would govern how American businesses provide health benefits to their employees. Fast forward to November of 2010. The American people did not forget their snubbing by self-proclaimed progressive Democrats, who in fact ignored the will of the people at every opportunity during the Obamacare debate. At voting booths across the country, they made clear to those congressmen and senators who provided the votes for this job-destroying health care bill that such high-handed, illiberal behavior was not acceptable in a democratic republic. Fast forward one more time. Yesterday, barely 13 months after Obamacare passed the Senate, and less than 1 year since it became law, the entire scheme was struck down in federal court. In a triumph for both personal liberty and the American Constitution, the individual mandate was found unconstitutional and Obamacare was struck down. Not part of Obamacare, all of Obamacare. Not surprisingly, the administration and its special interest allies responded with the same derision toward ordinary American citizens that has been on display throughout the debate. Instead of acknowledging the obvious, that Obamacare represents a massive departure from any traditional understanding of limited government, White House officials went on the attack, calling the decision outside of the mainstream and ridiculing its reasoning. Why? Really? Millions and millions of Americans believe that provisions essential to the operation of Obamacare are unconstitutional intrusions on personal liberty that vastly expand the power of the federal government. They understand that the justification for the individual mandate by Obamacare's proponents essentially removes any limits on the power of the federal government to regulate personal and economic decisions. 26 states participated in this challenge to Obamacare. 32 members of this body, including myself, signed an amicus brief challenging the constitutionality of Obamacare. But according to the administration's narrative, we are the ones who are out of the mainstream. The administration came into office buoyed by the goodwill of the American people and carrying banners of bipartisanship. 2 years later, after the politically disastrous decision to overhaul 1/7 of the nation's economy with virtually no Republican support, they are blaming the victim. After a federal judge took on this tough issue, or looked at this tough issue, and determined that key elements of Obamacare represented an unprecedented and unconstitutional expansion of the national government, the problem remains, as it always is for liberals, the people. Their views are not just sophisticated enough to grasp Obamacare's consistency with a government of limited and enumerated powers. The Democrats continue to think that if only they focus group Obamacare better, they will get the messaging right. The American people will learn to love it. I don't think so. The American people get it. They know, and I know my constituents in Utah do. In an article yesterday in Politico, Patrick Cadell and Douglas Schoen highlighted the reasons for the public's deepening disdain for Obamacare. According to them, it is possible that no major piece of legislation has created the continued vehement public opposition that health care has provoked since the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. In their view, there is one big underlying factor that continues to cause many Americans to oppose the health care bill. Its passage was anti-democratic. If the Republicans' campaign slogan of 1854 was crime against Kansas, in 2010, that slogan would be crime against democracy. Americans know that the Senate bill was 2,074 pages long. They know that it authorized 70 new government programs. They know that it delegated regulatory power to the Obama administration 1,697 times. They know that it cut $465 billion from Medicare at a time when it already faced a $38 trillion unfunded liability. They know that the bill took from one already unsustainable entitlement to pay for a brand new entitlement. They know that it raised taxes by over $550 billion, repeatedly violating the president's pledge not to raise taxes on middle-class families. They know that Obamacare destroyed 695,000 American jobs, or will destroy that many jobs, at a time when millions of Americans are looking for work. They know that the Medicaid expansions threaten to bankrupt the states, with CBO estimating that the Medicaid expansion will cost American taxpayers $435 billion additional dollars over 10 years. They know that the total cost of Obamacare is $2.6 trillion extrapolated over 10 years. And they know that we can't afford it. The American people aren't stupid. They understand these things. To borrow from Justice Scalia, the American people despise Obamacare because the American people love democracy and the American people are not fools. They know that this law was enacted in a totally partisan manner and over the loud opposition of the majority of Americans. And they know that the partisans promoting Obamacare were not and are not forthright when they say that it is budget neutral. Obamacare cuts $155 billion from hospitals. It cuts $202 billion from 11 million seniors on Medicare Advantage. It cuts nearly $15 billion from nursing homes. It cuts nearly $40 billion from home health agencies. It cuts nearly $7 billion from hospices. But these cuts don't go towards strengthening Medicare, a program with catastrophic unfunded liabilities. Rather, Democrats poured the savings from these cuts back into a brand new, unsustainable entitlement program. Furthermore, so-called comprehensive health care reform managed to neglect the pressing need for a permanent doc fix. Yet CBO's most recent estimate is that a long-term doc fix freezing Medicare payment rates at 2011 levels would raise the deficit by $249 billion, not counting an additional $53 billion in debt service obligations. Not surprisingly, an Associated Press fact check of the President's State of the Union address concluded, quote, "The idea that Obama's health care law saves money for the government is based on some arguable assumptions," unquote. That might qualify for the understatement of the year so far. The likelihood that Obamacare will not, as its advocates claim, save the government money was confirmed again in a hearing held last week by the CMS chief actuary, Richard Foster. He testified that the law will not likely hold costs down, and that contrary to the president's mantra, everyone will not be able to keep their insurance coverage if they like it. In response, the White House political operation attacked the administration's own nonpartisan professional expert, stating in a blog post, once again, "We disagree," they said. Quote, "History shows that it is possible to implement measures that will save money for Medicare and the federal government," unquote. Who are you going to believe? The chief actuary at CMS, their actuary, or a White House political operative? The average American citizen might not have a PhD in economics, but Americans do understand that massive new entitlement programs do not save money. In their guts, the American people know that former CBO Director Douglas Holtz-Eakin is right when he concludes that repeal of this flawed law would actually reduce the deficit by $300 billion. Ultimately, all we want is a vote on repeal. Last week, some of my Democratic colleagues came to the floor to advocate for rules changes that would have substantially limited the rights or the right of the minority to debate. The filibuster, they insisted, is an affront to democracy and majority rule. Well, let them put their money where their mouths are. All we're asking for is an up or down vote on repeal of Obamacare. That is what the people want. Ultimately, you have to ask why the Democratic majority would deny us this vote. I think I know the answer. It has a great deal to do with members of the caucus who know their constituents hate this law. Yeah, it has a lot to do with members of the Democratic caucus who know their constituents hate this law. Yet these members are torn between two masters. On the one hand are their conservative constituents, and on the other are the liberal interest groups who supported the government takeover of the nation's health care system. Unfortunately, the people again stand to lose in this calculus. I understand that the conventional wisdom tomorrow is that my colleagues and I are pursuing a symbolic act. The guardians of the conventional wisdom will opine that attempts to repeal Obamacare might make for good theater, but are senseless exercises. In my view, this attitude demonstrates a profound lack of respect for the citizens of this democratic republic. Over time, given the power of ideas and an enraged and engaged citizenry, initially, symbolic acts have a way of becoming law. Or in this case, have a way of getting rid of this law. It might not happen overnight, but citizens exercising their constitutional rights of petition and redress have a way of reminding even the most hard-hearted and most hardened of partisan politicians that their job is to represent their constituents. I have no doubt that some will scoff at our efforts to repeal this bill. But I rest easy knowing that I am standing with my fellow Utahns and the people of this country whose distrust of Obamacare grows the more they learn about it. I look forward to the day when Obamacare is finally repealed. It may not be next month, it may not be next year, but it will be repealed. And if we're smart, we'll make it next month or within the very near future. And when it is, it will be a triumph for our Constitution, it will be a triumph for personal liberty, and most importantly, it will be a triumph for the American people who persevered in their resistance to this law. Madam President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.